Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Plot Matrix Season .333 finale. But don't click away because if you're new here, this is the perfect time to jump in. We are a follow-along screenwriting podcast where, over the course of a season, we are developing a movie idea into a feature-length script. And today, we are going over our basic three-act structure, our basic plot outline. So if you're new here, it's a great time to jump in and join the writer's room. I am Jackson Casimiro, your host, and here's my sidekick, Brian Smail III.
I'm the protagonist. I'm nobody's second.
And on this episode, we're even going to tell you how our movie ends. So, spoiler alert.
I don't know how it ends. So how are you going to tell me?
Scroll down in the document and you'll see.
Oh, I didn't want to look at that.
Thank you so much for getting dressed up for this episode, Brian.
This is the closest thing to a nice shirt that I own. After I graduated prep school, I decided to get rid of anything that kind of resembled a collar that wasn't either a meme or a soccer kit. So I'm kind of fresh out of any quality dress clothing.
I mean, I don't know if you count a Pizza Hut polo shirt as dress clothing.
It was Little Caesars, and I'm offended that you would confuse those two.
I should have expected that because you typically are hot and ready.
I want out of this world. Well, thank you. I'm actually just following your lead. I was not anticipating ever really looking nice on the show. I don't really respect our viewers, and I didn't think it was worth the time. But now that I'm here, I feel pretty good.
Well, yeah, I mean, I did dress up for this episode because we're calling this our season .3 or .5 finale. Because after this, we're actually going to take a little bit of a hiatus while Brian is working on his feature-length film that he's actually producing. And while we're taking that hiatus, we're just going to take that opportunity to sort of reset, plan our future guests, our future episodes. So this episode is the perfect cliffhanger where we're taking everything that we've worked on and learned so far and giving it to you as the three-act structure, the basic outline.
And then hopefully for some of you that might be tuning in and out, this is a great opportunity to catch all the way up on all of the episodes and see some of the ideas that have found their way into this outline. This is by no means set in stone, but this is a really good opportunity to get the gears moving for everyone in the audience who might be wanting to contribute a team or a moment or a beat, whatever it is. This is a good chance to see what we have in mind before we take a little bit of a break. And then once we return, we're going to really hit the ground running and start chiseling away at getting the writing done for this three-act structure that we have planned out.
So if you're unfamiliar, most movies use what's called a three-act structure to kind of organize their storytelling. And we have decided to kind of go with this classic rising and falling action just so that we can nail it really well.
But just because this is the tried and true, consistent screenwriting method doesn't mean that we don't have a few twists and turns planned. We're doing everything that we can to make sure that the entire story follows the logical path that it should. But we do want to introduce some concepts that are very particular to us and the stories that we like to tell that will make this a little bit different than your standard Hollywood action movie.
So if you're joining us today, we're working on a film called Linwood Treasure Co. And so I'm going to read you the log line, which is basically just the short description of what the movie is. It is as follows. A company has created a whole industry around designing high-stakes treasure hunts. Contestants pay a huge entrance fee to get the initial clue, setting them out on a global adventure to unearth the prize. So, if you have been following along thus far, feel free to skip ahead. But if you are joining us, we're going to do just a little overview of the need-to-know characters that we're going to be talking about on this outline. First up, the protagonist is who we covered the last episode. But what you need to know is that they are joining the treasure hunt through the creation of this new grant program. So about a year before this treasure hunt begins, Linwood put out basically a puzzle that anybody in the world could solve. And our three members of this protagonist team successfully solved this puzzle, and then they were put together on this team and given $100,000 to use as their resources. And this is basically a way for Linwood to sort of save face and say that, we're not this super elitist organization. There's this on-ramp to a way that any smart person could participate. So these three characters are definitely the underdogs against our antagonist.
And then our antagonist, who we really fully developed in episode 6, gave him a whole timeline full of his history. His name is Dennis Hudson. And he has won the competition year after year after year since I believe the 80s, if I remember the timeline correctly. And the reason why he's able to still compete is when Linwood rebranded in the mid 40s, they decided to introduce an auto bid system where whoever wins the treasure hunt at hand is invited back for the following treasure hunt to continuously compete. And Dennis Hudson really exploited the system, won his first time, and then redefined his winnings to be the foundation of his company. As a person, Dennis Hudson is a very eccentric tycoon. We're imagining Jack Nicholson in any role after he turned 30 years old, where just explosive energy, a lot of fun, but definitely a little bit unhinged. And he's the head of this massive corporation that makes all of its money, spends all of its time just prepping for this treasure hunt. This treasure hunt is its lifeline. And at first we had just established Dennis Hudson as the only antagonist, but a new character that we're bringing today is the idea of a field marshal. And the field marshal is somebody who will be commanding the runners as they go from clue to clue. They'll be leading the Hudson team actually out in the field, but Dennis himself is calling the shots from the war room. And as we're going to see over the course of this plot structure, Dennis and this field marshal, who we haven't named yet, are going to be at odds. This person is a very clear, analytical mind. Their only concern is solving every clue in the most efficient manner possible. But Dennis is very egotistical and he wants to make sure that he's doing it his way. So we'll see that as the Hudson Company starts to fall a little bit behind, those two antagonists start to have a little bit of internal turmoil, similar to how the Grant team will also have its own inner conflict brewing throughout.
But then our basic theme, protagonist versus antagonist, is kind of an allegory for meritocracy versus incumbency. The idea that, hey, there's this like myth of if you're just smart and you work hard, you can win the treasure hunt, versus the reality that the incumbents have all of these resources to just hold on to their power year after year.
Yeah, and there'll be plenty of other characters as well. This treasure hunt is huge, so there's tons and tons of teams, and we'll be getting into a few of those later on. But these two teams of the Hudson Treasure Company and the Grant team with its 3 members are our major characters that we'll be examining today for the plot structure.
So, with that, I think we'll get into act number 1, starting with our first beat, which is the exposition. It starts off the opening scene with everybody being notified that they're able to participate in the treasure hunt. This is probably a couple weeks before it actually begins. So in the case of the incumbent, it is just confirming that they're allowed in for winning the last cycle. For the Grant team, it is these 3 people being notified that they were correct in the puzzle and they will be formed onto a team. And then for everybody else, there's a raffle system and it's time to pay up $100,000 to get entered.
And we've realized over the course of outlining this that there is a lot of preliminary information necessary to fully understand what this treasure hunt is, the system of it, the competitors. So what we've decided to do is envision this in a documentarian style. We had talked a little bit in the past about, starting it off with a news clip and how that may or may not be cheesy. And we feel like if we take it a step further and put it more in the vein of a expose doc or a 30 for 30 like ESPN, of following these competitors as they prep for the competition or as the Hudson team celebrates their previous victories with some crazy highlight reel of amazing moments. We'll intercut those very quickly and have it be a hustle and bustle feel to get us into the actual energy of the movie. And once that sequence is over and we kind of get a broad overview of all the competitors, we'll trickle into our first real meaty character scene where we meet the Grant team and the Grant team meets each other. And we see what they bring to the table. And then following that, we'll kick it over to the antagonist and see Hudson address his troops and his preparation for war type speech. And just introducing the field marshal and getting ready for the inciting incident, which comes directly after those 2 scenes.
Right. And I think it's fair to approach this documentary style because if you remember when I was first pitching it, my idea was for the movie to have some like interesting stylistic pieces to it that just make it more quirky and more Tarantino. So I think just using a documentary style here and there makes perfect sense. And I mean, please, we just want to get to the action. So it's a quick and snappy way to get us into the story. But what comes after that is what any good screenplay has, something that's pretty easy to pick out anytime you're watching a TV show or a movie. It is what we call the inciting incident. And that is very obvious what this beat is. In our film, it is all of the teams being seeded the first initial clue.
If there's anyone upset about how obvious it is, leave, because it is the only thing that makes sense, and we'll get right into the action really as quickly as possible. Because while we're going to talk a lot about character here, and we haven't actually developed the clues and the locations that they take place at yet, still a major driving force of this movie are those clues and those places that we go to and experiencing those cultures. So we want to make sure that we're spending as much time in that as possible.
So we don't have the details of the treasure hunt itself to share with you today, just like the plot implications of everything that happens. But what that's going to look like is traveling around the world, car chases, solving riddles, picking locks, all of those types of action movie things we want involved. And by the end of Act 1, we will have solved clue number 1.
And the climax of this first act is where we're going to see our antagonist and protagonist first go head to head. Hudson is not really expecting anyone to have a slight chance, could be considering for all the past treasure hunts, no one has even kept up close after the first clue. So when the Grant team puts out a surprisingly good showing and proves that they're able to hang with the top dogs, Hudson kind of just shakes it off. Hudson is anticipating, you know what, this is a fluke. Not every race can start as perfectly as they normally do. So his own hubris is already starting to get to him a bit, but we see at this point that the Grant team really is here to play, and they have a lot that they're fighting for. So it'll trickle into Act 2 as tensions start to rise, both within Hudson's team trying to, play off their misfortunes that may have happened to keep morale high, but having that little inkling in the back of their head that something might be going wrong, while the Grant team is feeling pretty good about their status already.
Yeah, and so this takes us up to about 20, 25 minutes into the movie. We've met the characters, we've seen some action, and now for us to continue, this is a good place to let the characters take a breather and get a little bit more of that backstory, see how their relationships are starting to form, and also start to set up some of the secondary layers of conflict here. Some of the inner conflict, we alluded to that, Hudson might also be on the run from the government because he might have killed someone last season. So as we're starting Act 2, it's a place that we can start to build a little bit more of that complexity, get into the characters a little bit more, and the beat that we're going to do that on is our clue number 2. So we're imagining kind of 5 main clues or sections to the treasure hunt. So it makes sense that we would just proceed on to the next clue, where we would basically push all of this a little bit further and establish more of the dynamic.
Right. And it's at this clue where we really start to see the Hudson field marshal dichotomy, because the field marshal, being so calculated, is really only focused on solving the clues, but Hudson is now getting fixated on destroying the Grant team, destroying this team that has been given a free entry to this competition that he pays for every year and has won every year. He sees it as almost a spit in his eye. So the conflict starts to brew over between him and his field marshal, because he's expecting his field marshal to bring the results that he wants. But when the Grant team just continuously pushes back, we see the chasm between those two continue to widen, and we see the Grant team start to have to think a little bit more carefully about the moves that they make, because they're already stepping on some toes that they weren't anticipating, and they're going back and forth now with Hudson's team at every little moment. And because of this, these other teams that have been left behind in the first clue are starting to catch up a little bit. The Grant team and Hudson jumped off to an early lead, but now we're seeing everybody else start to slowly edge their way back into the competition, which is not good for really anyone.
So with that, we can probably just move on to clue number 3, which is where we start to break down and change the dynamic a little bit, just to bring the action to the next level, rise the stakes a little bit more. And so the main piece of that puzzle is Hudson coming onto the field off his ivory tower.
Say it. What is it? What is it?
Oh my. Okay.
What is it?
I did not need a reference from the kids movie Tron Legacy
It's not a kids movie.
to explain to me what the fact that Hudson comes to the field.
It's the perfect clip. If I almost want to put the link in the description, it's such a good clip. It's just Jeff Bridges appearing in this club after being off the grid for decades because he doesn't want to approach the conflict because he's done his time. And he finally re-enters the field and everything stops. And that's exactly the feel that we want here.
Because remember, Hudson is a towering figure in the industry, and him showing up, everybody's sort of starstruck by this fact. But he proves himself. He's still a capable operator. And so we imagine at this clue number 3, even though the Grant team and potentially some others are still ahead of him, he is going to try to, I'm calling it, close the door behind him.
We have yet to figure out what the actual clues are physically. When I said, I don't know, maybe a plaque, Jackson actually did a spit take into his webcam. So that kind of hurt my feelings. But we're imagining something that is going to be hard to dismantle or to vandalize or get rid of. But somehow Hudson, in his years of experience, finds a way to really destroy this clue so that the only people who are ahead of him are the only people left. But it's also at this point, because he's re-entered the field, that he relieves the field marshal of their duties. He does not think she has anything more to add to the competition. He is fully committed to just continuing his method, which is, in all reality, scorched earth.
But so it's at this point that because we've maybe set these dominoes up, the field marshal might have evidence on Hudson, damning evidence about maybe past disappearances, all the things that Hudson has done to stay on top, including in this year's cycle. And I think that the idea that the field marshal goes AWOL and tries to start their own team, that is definitely a big possibility at this point. But I also wanted to say that we've had this idea that this is an industry, and we picked that word because we want the treasure hunt and its money to just bulldoze through communities, basically. And, well, we don't want them to.
Yeah, that's an awful way to say that.
No, yeah, we don't. It's fictional. But because
we want to
of that,
represent what actually happens. Modern tourism, more times than not, is more destructive than it is actual cultural enlightenment and actual involvement with the world that you're exploring and the respect for it to leave it better than you found it, right? But these people don't care about that at all. The only thing that they see is a possible $50 million US on the end of the other side. So they do not care about any of the places that they're actually going to, which is in reality a bit ironic now that I think about it, because when this treasure hunt was started, it was for the exploration. It was for the experience of just getting across the world. And these people are going to these places and not actually caring at all. The only thing they care about is getting out as fast as possible.
Which is why this is late stage treasure hunt industry.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So the way that we're representing all of that in this particular scene is, as we were alluding to in the first 2 clues, of these other teams catching up because the top 2 were battling within one another. Everyone at this point, or at least all the good teams at this point, have found their way back up to pace with the Grant team in Hudson. So we're viewing this location as a bit of a bottleneck, where so many teams now have caught back up that Hudson's appearing of the field is a resetting of the power dynamic. And that's why he shuts the door behind him, because there are so many teams that could make it out of this location and actually pose a threat. But by putting his foot down and destroying that clue, he stops the bottleneck right there.
Right. Which is also thematically for me, shut the door behind you, is like the irony of a country of immigrants being anti-immigration. It's just like Hudson, we established in his backstory that he was the underdog at one point in time. And even though he had some privilege, he was able to get up to that position. But now he uses his power and resources to cut off the chance of success from everybody else. But he's fallen behind already. So it's only at this point that there's only like a half dozen teams that are even able to continue. Him being one of them, but also the Grant team. if we're counting the field marshal.
Yeah, some of the defectors with the field marshal that maybe have become uncomfortable with Hudson's usage of power this time around. Where, as we're seeing the lengths that he'll go throughout this, he really starts to alienate his closest supporters because it's a matter of life and death later on. And some people are finally coming to the moral understanding that maybe traveling the world for $50 million isn't worth all of the damage that we cause. So there'll be some moments in there for Hudson's team to continually fracture and leave him, hopefully by the end, completely alone out of his own greed.
Right. The arc for Hudson is he's just going to be a crazy old man by the end of it.
Exactly. So once we get to the other side of Dennis destroying that clue and shutting that door behind him, we have officially reached the midpoint. And now I'll give it to Jackson to give us our midpoint twist.
I think in a 3-act structure, it's a good opportunity to use the midpoint to have some type of paradigm shift, have some type of either like intervention or, we discussed a lot of possibilities for this, but ultimately we decided that Hudson was going to offer the Grant team a buyout because, he's still down bad and he cares so much about holding on to his position because basically he knows that if he doesn't win this year, he's probably never going to compete again. Just because of the chances of winning the raffle, it's probably not going to happen. And especially because a lot of what we're doing is talking about money here, it makes sense that he's just offering a buyout, and that's going to introduce a little bit of inner conflict into our protagonist team. So literally, I'm sure this imagines a face-to-face meeting of the two teams to discuss their options.
The way that I've been looking at Hudson is he is the house. He is the casino. He's the one making the odds. Even though Linwood is setting up all the money and creating the actual competition, he is the one who is deciding whether or not somebody's a favorite. So I imagine he goes to them with something like, look, you only got about 40,000 of that 100 grand left. You aren't going to really make it that much further than here. I'm going to give you the option right now for $1 million that you guys can split to walk away from this forever. And this is guaranteed money in your pocket. Sure, you can make 50 mil, but what are the odds of that, really? And I think now that we're seeing Hudson back in the field, we're also starting to see them pick up more momentum because he is willing to do those things that other people wouldn't for whatever reason. Whether they think it's too much of a diversion or whether they think it's morally reprehensible, they just aren't willing to go to the same lengths that Hudson is.
And because Hudson is manipulative, that may be his offer to the three of them, but then he also might pull Jane aside, who is sort of proving herself to be the smartest of the three, and say, well, why not you also join me to make sure we can beat everybody else, and maybe even doing something different to one of them and pitting them against each other, because it's also at this scene that I want Hudson to demonstrate to them that he is unhinged and he is falling apart. And, in past episodes, I mentioned that he's probably superstitious in some ways. Yeah. And I would like this to be, if I'm going to keep the Inglourious Bastards, like the scene at the bar that was like 10 minutes.
The wrong three.
Right. So I'm imagining this midpoint scene to be sort of this long, hopefully really well written and constructed, where there's people pulling aside, and it's almost like a game of risk and diplomacy, and there's a lot of shuffling, but the result is that the protagonists decline, which enrages Hudson. He feels disrespected, and it sets us up for kind of this disastrous next beat.
So at clue 4 now, after they have completely shut him down, is when Hudson fully jumps off the cliff and decides there is no going back for me. It's now or never. And fueled by his disrespect, he makes his biggest rule-breaking moment yet. And we say rule-breaking in air quotes because there are really no rules. We've kind of established that there's a unwritten rule book of gamesmanship, but there's not a lot of...
There's no referee.
Yeah, Linwood is not going to interject at all. Linwood is really even hands-off in the sense that, if you kill somebody, really, it's not our fault. We didn't tell you to do that. So there's only the laws of the places that you're in that can actually define you. And I think Hudson is a clear lawbreaker, and I think here he takes it to that extreme where he takes this moment to try to physically stop the Grant team. And in that process, he severely injures Bobby, the elder member of the Grant team, and deprives the Grant team of the information that they need to continue on to the next clue. And this moment here, whether it's Bobby jumped in the way of his younger cohorts to kind of defend them and sacrifice himself, or whether it was a deliberate targeting by him, we don't know yet. But we just wanted this moment a chance to separate the Grant team as the internal tension of, oh, maybe we should have took this offer. Maybe do we really have a chance, being down on their luck as the clues are getting harder and the competition is getting further. Taking this moment to really push them down into the all is lost moment.
Right. So this is something that action movies do particularly well. It's this down moment right before we sort of build back up to the climax. And compared to a lot of graphs of a 3-act structure, I'm actually going to do a little falling action dip right before we go to this climax, because it's this moment where it feels like all the work we put in has been for nothing. And it's not necessarily like a false ending because they're still in the running, but it's going to take another little paradigm shift to bring them back up to like an equal playing field to be able to compete in the climax. And I decided pretty early on that I wanted there to be some type of, I'm calling it divine intervention moment for our all is lost, to basically get them back up on their feet with the information that they need. And so Bobby's hospitalized, they're separated, they don't know where to go. Hudson has taken the lead, and it takes a little bit of a helpful push in order to get there. And we've decided to make this anonymous. So do you want to say what that is?
Do you want me to explain what anonymous means?
No, do you want to say what the divine intervention is?
So what we've imagined so far is that we're in this hospital room. We're in this scene wherever Bobby is trying to recover. And there's a moment between Alice and Jane where they're really going over everything that's happened. They know that they don't have the offer anymore from Hudson. They know that they could take the remaining money and run at this point, but it's so little that it's not going to change a whole lot of their lives, as opposed to, the 50 million that could happen. And right as they're debating whether or not they should continue, we imagine something like a package or a card or a get well soon sort of message from somebody to Bobby is brought in. And using the clever skills that they have, they decode that this is actually a hint. It's another clue from whoever it is to get them back up on their feet and into the running. Because after Hudson hurts Bobby, they fully kind of abandon the treasure hunt to make sure that he is taken care of. So they lose out on a lot of time, and they haven't solved the 4th clue yet. So this little hint is enough to get them back into the running, enough to compete for the 5th and final clue.
And so it's this tip that brings the protagonist team back together a little bit, because after that midpoint where they get manipulated, they really are at odds about the options that they have. And it'll make more sense if you go and listen to the protagonist episode, because we've set them up to be this, like, not love triangle, but they have different and overlapping motivations. And it's Alice who maybe would want to just take the money. It's Jane who maybe wants to take the moral high ground. But it's Bobby who,
with his experience and his elder years, actually is able to give them a broader perspective than just what one of those single-dimensional aspects will contain. But at this point, on the other hand, Hudson has alienated his entire team. So while the Grant team is getting a small glimmer of hope that they're going to be able to continue out on this hunt, Hudson is being completely abandoned by all the people that he trusted to get him this far.
Even though he's saying, look, I kicked them out of the running. We're going to be fine. We're going to do it. He's also just bitter and angry and unraveling. And it's this beat that I'm calling preparing for battle. So people are motivated, including the other teams that are still in the running at this point. I imagine sort of a montage. Maybe it's the documentary again, but everybody's like putting on their armor, figuring out where they're going to go for the last clue. they're like motivated and ready to win this treasure.
And here begins the climax of both Act 2 and the movie. And there's a choice at the end of it that I think might be a little controversial, but hopefully will start some good discussion down in the comments. So prepare yourselves, because we have a fun little twist coming. And Jackson hates twists and came up with this himself. So I'm actually all for it.
Yeah. So the actual details of what this climax is, this is going to be probably the most physical, like action movie element of it. Picking that final setting is going to be a really tough choice. Is it an abandoned mine? Is it
Waterbury, Connecticut.
Exactly. Is it the lost city of Atlantis? Whatever that final location is, this is a moment for sort of spectacle and the heroes to really show what they're made of. Hudson to really, come to his final point. Everybody's arcs are peaking in this moment, except Bobby, who's on the sidelines, right? And it's here that if we're deciding that the field marshal is going to come back into it, this would be the point that she does that. But really, it's this fight where we're closing in on the head-to-head battle, truly, of Hudson versus, I would say, Alice on our protagonist team. And they know where they need to go, but they're just trying to physically get to the treasure, get there first, extract it. And what do they find?
Not a single thing. Not even a penny. Not a single hint. That's not true. There is a hint that the treasure was there.
Right.
But it's gone. It's clear it was there, but somebody took it and left and never comes forward to actually reveal their identity. Why?
Right. So, you may be wondering, is this just a dumb, silly ending? But it is, yes. But it is based in our theme, and there are just so many possibilities for where that treasure could have gone that we can basically use the writing process of this podcast to push forward the possibilities of all of these different possible endings. And I would say that the film itself won't actually hint to one of those, but me and Brian and our guest writers will probably advance all of these possibilities so that there can be an actual discussion about what happened in the end, but no conclusive answer. And the way that it plays into our theme is what no one winning does, and what it says is it destroys the incumbency. And I don't know if Linwood's going to change its rules after that. Maybe they will. But there is no auto bid to the next year. Hudson is put out to pasture as the crazy old man. And it's unclear where that money has gone.
Yeah, I think a lot of the fun is going to be trying to put those little signposts that if you look back and watch it again with a careful eye, you might say, oh, this moment happened here. So obviously it was the field marshal sharing some information with another team. But then hopefully somebody at another point could be like, oh, wait, no, it can't be, because this information given here actually hints to somebody else. And I think too often when you're writing, you're expected to have every single answer, where even if you and I at the end of this don't feel like we know exactly who won the treasure, as long as there are multiple options that feel like it could happen, I think to me that's just as fulfilling as seeing the Grant team win the entire thing and achieve the underdog story and go off into the happy ever ending after. Happy ever after ending? Happy ever after ending. Jackson and I talked about this a lot, and I pushed back on it for no other reason than this movie seems really realistic, in the sense that by treating it as an actual industry and seeing how ridiculous it could become, it just feels out of place to let this underdog team on their first time ever having a Grant team in the competition win the whole thing. But what seems more impactful is having them dismantle the institution that has been standing for so long.
Right. Because call me cynical, but if we let the protagonist win, we are basically saying that, well, there is a meritocracy. There is a way to just be smart and win your way into a position of power, which is obviously true. Like some people obviously do that. But I don't know if I particularly would want to like advance that narrative, because I think that it's that narrative that's the potentially destructive thing, is that instead of having just like an equitable system, we're having this winner take all like fallacy that, oh, it's just your smarts that take you to the top.
But with all that in mind, that is the conclusion of Act 2 and the climax. And now we move into Act 3, which is the resolution, the falling action, the denouement. And I'll hand it over to Jackson to explain what's going on directly after those events.
Right. So typically you have a lot of wrap up here, but any wrap up we need to do would maybe be best done through the documentary format, because
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly.
Okay. You're a little too invested in that, Mr. Found Footage. Because we don't want to give away, we don't want to basically wink at one of these theories as to where the treasure has gone. And we don't want to invalidate the possibility that the protagonist won after all, you know?
There's no Dark Knight Rises final scene where Bruce Wayne is sitting at a cafe with Catwoman and Michael Caine is telling us exactly what happened. You know, none of that.
I'm hoping that it goes with the idea that we're writing this as a podcast, and we're going to make a little bit more room for alternative theories and basically things that we can build into the script. Like, all right, I want to incorporate the possibility that it was the game master and Bobby who had this conspiracy. So, you know, I'm going to pepper in a couple foreshadowing things. So I'm hoping that we're opening the film to the audience a little bit better by doing this. So there are a couple like obvious things that we should do in the wrap up to sort of conclude the character arcs. So Bobby and Jane are close friends. I think that's
Bobby survives.
Yeah,
Go
Bobby survives.
And modern medicine.
And even though she didn't win, or maybe she did, Alice's notoriety and skill that she exhibited in this treasure hunt implies that she'll improve her station for her and her family and find success. But on the other hand, Hudson has lost his incumbent status. His team has abandoned him. He is rich, but he is maidenless.
L plus ratio.
Right. He's probably like vowing he's going to find the missing treasure and bring them to justice because they broke their rules or some horrible hypocritical thing. So, you know, this wrap up is going to include more once we go back through and have specifics, I would presume.
Well, that's it for that's the whole story. We don't actually need to write it because we just said it all here.
Well, there is a lot of work left. There is maybe 2/3 left in a 30 episode season of writing this fucking thing. But that I hope is like a framework that's a little easier to engage with. And it gives you a lot to think about as we, go on our little hiatus.
Why are we going on a hiatus?
Well, because Brian has to go shoot a film that he wrote by himself.
I did.
You didn't even crowd write your film. That's like so old school.
I sent you the script 2 weeks ago and you haven't given me notes. So can't say I didn't try.
Yeah, because I had to step up and write the ending for Linwood and
no, come on.
Write the
come on, don't do this
protagonist,
for the
and
cameras.
I
Don't
thought
do this
you were
for
the
the
screenwriter
cameras.
and I was the host, but okay.
We talked for like 20 minutes before.
Well, what you can expect during this hiatus, which is going to be a month to 6 weeks, somewhere like that, while Brian is shooting. You should expect that we'll get a check-in from Brian about how production is going on his film. Again, this is a film, I think we mentioned this, but I have a cameo in it. It's going to be something we'll talk more about on the channel once he's shot it and in post and all that kind of thing. But it should be pretty fun and entertaining, and it's definitely in the sort of neighborhood of immature movies that him and I make.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's also we'll probably do a feedback episode. We'll probably distribute some like written materials so that you can get like a more organized version of this 3-act structure if you choose to do your own fan fiction on it or whatever during this hiatus. But it's basically a good chance for us to also reset, book some of our guests, and just gear up for finishing the season. And we're also going to promote the podcast a little bit more and like use this episode as a way to bring more people in to actually listen and engage with this thing, which I also think is easier to engage with now that there's so much of the story there. But that leads me to your homework. Share the podcast. Share this episode of the podcast with your friends.
Share it. I swear to God, if you don't do it, I swear.
Well, if you're one of those people that it was shared with, please subscribe.
Yeah, it's free. It's fun. We're going nowhere. Come along for the ride.
And good luck, Brian, on your film and doing production without me. But that's gonna bring us to closing out.
What do you mean? What do you mean doing production without you? You want to be my sound mixer?
No, I saw the Harbor Freight tool organizer. That's your sound mixer with the Velcro and the super glue. I saw it. All right. Well, that was the first third of the first season of Plot Matrix, the follow along screenwriting podcast. Engage with us in the YouTube comments or on our Instagram. We are just at Plot Matrix. You can find our show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts as an audio version. Your hosts are us, the very handsome Jackson Casimiro, and the very handsome Brian Smail III. All right, well, this was a production of Lunation Lab. Learn more at lunationlab.com.
To everyone who's been watching, thank you for sticking with us. To everyone who's new, welcome along to the ride. We'll see you.
I'll say it. I'll have the last word. See you this autumn.
Okay, let's cut.